the microphone and I am not, so you'll be able to hear her even better than you can hear me, which is the idea. My name is Liz Richmond. I'm a member of the Adult Formation Committee at St. Paul's, and I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker at the forum. Natalie Kertes Weaver is Professor of Religious Studies and Theology and Pastoral Ministry at Ursuline College in Pepper Pike, Ohio. She is co-director of the Master of Arts program in Theology and Pastoral Studies. Natalie has published Marriage and Family, a Christian Theological Foundation, Christian Thought and Practice, a Primer, The Theology of Suffering and Dying, an Introduction for Caregivers, Christian Thought and Practice, the Revised Edition, articles and essays on women, religion, motherhood, sexual ethics, and other topics in theology, as well as 2 art books, Baby's First Latin and Interior Design. Natalie speaks internationally on topics in her field and is an active volunteer in her church community. Natalie is currently developing books on sex and the body and music and theology. She is a regular contributor to the daily blog Feminism and Religion and has recently developed an open source course on the Introduction to Ethics for use in college classrooms for the state of Ohio. Please join me in welcoming back Dr. Natalie Weaver.
In my effort to make that available, I pulled it up. Okay. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So good to see you. And this is really exciting for me to be back with you. I'm grateful for the opportunity to come visit and to be in this very magnificent space with you. The topic of this series is examining conscience in Christian narrative. And before I launch into the actual content here, I want to provide a little bit of a context for where this conversation came from, and also to, as these 4 weeks progress, to give you a little of my own narrative, my own Christian story, as kind of the context for my thinking. As a teacher at Ursuline College and in my life and whatever I do, I find that I've discovered about myself that my modus operandi is that I kind of share my thinking out loud. So I always look at my work and my conversations as sort of a process of discovery. And thinking about conscience has been another one of these opportunities that's kind of real discovery for me. And also I'll give you a little bit of a background about where this came from. I was asked by a formation group in a Roman Catholic church to help them think about the primacy of conscience. And this is an important sort of idea in Catholic circles because conscience is considered, the way I described it, is sort of like you're on the bus with the church. And then the church is finally going somewhere that you can't go with it, and conscience allows you to get off the bus. That's stop. Even though, and it's sort of like your get out of jail free card. It's kind of like it's this sort of pass if you can't continue on. There's this sort of ultimacy or pride of the function of conscience and the religious mind of the individual, a core religious freedom. But in thinking about this, I was discovering, and I have discovered, that conscience is far more primary and more essential in Christian story. That is, it's the discussion of it and the function it plays in the characters and in the narratives and in the way we talk and in the narratives we give and in our confessions. I mean, conscience is really, this is like, in my opinion, a sort of vastly under-discussed aspect of personhood. So that is the background, because I started thinking about conscience for this purpose, and then I thought I was really interested in examining it more carefully in a broader way. And so when I was asked to speak here for this Lenten series, I leapt at the opportunity to go more deeply into thinking about conscience. And then I learned that you all have been considering narrative over some period of time here. And this was also an interesting place to explore and examine conscience more fully. So the series is a 4-part series, and we talked about what these ideas might look like and how they might build a large story about how we can revive and think about conscience. So the sessions, this one today, I'll go back to that slide in a moment. This one today is conscience and the narrative of crucifixion. So what today's conversation is intended to do is explore conscience in the foundational Christian story of Jesus, and to examine that his relationship with his Father is the defining characteristic of his conscience. And then to sort of build upon the interaction with Jesus of characters in Scripture to see what insights we might have into their consciences. And then to comment very broadly about the function of conscience in the epistles and where it occurs and how we might understand it. So the second of our conversations will be focusing on the idea of confession and testimony and how we perform conscience in our Christian walks. And so there's a great deal of storytelling rooted in the kind of development of the faith experience, often including some sort of confessional moment that becomes very critical to the whole of the Christian story, but also to how people personally understand themselves. And then the third session will deal with conflict in conscience in Christian characters. And one of the things that sort of first popped to my mind when I was considering conscience is that conscience frequently has this is viewed, and I think this is skewed perhaps and not skewed in that it's wrong, but skewed in that it's only half of the story, but that conscience is often viewed as that which kind of stops us from doing something wrong. You know, it's the little voice that says, no, 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 or judges us. And that is indeed one of the primary ways that conscience was described, particularly in the pre-Christian era. But it's also the case that in those tense moments or the contrast experiences that the church generally, and by that I mean like the whole church, all of the people, not any one denomination, but that there has actually been the possibility of both growth and development. And so I will, in the third of our sessions, be considering the moments or key moments of crisis that actually prompt ongoing formation and reformation of relevant Christian character. And then in the final session, we'll talk about Christian story and public conscience and the accountability of church communities to speak and to story themselves in a way that is attentive to justice and that is engaged in a way that brings forth those gospel goals and visions and hopes in a way that is constantly self-correcting and is attentive to the needs of the larger world. So that's what the series is intended to do in general. My goals for our series here are to revive discussion of conscience in a vital way. When we were first talking about conscience, a little image popped to mind. Can anyone think of, you got it, the little green man, right? A little teeny guy. And I guess the cricket, I suppose the cricket makes a little noise that you hear, and that's what the conscience is supposed to be. But as I have examined this and continue to examine it, I would like us to consider and to think about that conscience is less a cricket and more a roaring fire. It's really the like Pentecostal fire. And that is really how the great thinkers in the theological tradition have described conscience. This seat of God in the self, the place where the person has that experience of of the divine. And so this is really fascinating to me because as I have considered this, I realize I myself, in my various phases of study and formation over my life, have really not encountered a particularly engaged, meaningful discussion of conscience. I have studied and have a degree in philosophy and in classical studies, and a couple of them in theology and religion and ethics. And in any of those experiences, my exposure to the concept of conscience has mostly been to consider occasionally what someone may have said about it. But mostly the focus has been on sort of, ethics and reason, the sort of rational faculty of decision making, without a whole lot of mind paid to this idea of a location of sort of innate moral knowing, or a pre-philosophical moral awareness, or some part of the sense that is co-naturally engaged with God, in conversation with God, that really, in a sense, almost pre-exists the self. And I think you know what I'm talking about. I realize I just used sort of a complicated, language here to describe something very, common to us. But if you can think about your earliest experiences of conscience, when you first were aware of your own mind in that way, it probably was some time when you were a child. It was probably some moment when you absolutely knew something, right or wrong, where you felt either a great sense of justice or injustice, a great sense of I shouldn't be doing this, but I'm doing it anyway. Right? Was anyone bold enough to share their moment? All right, we got a volunteer here. I'll come over here. You can speak into my mic. What is your moment? Wait, your name too? Pat, okay. There you go, Pat. Yeah, you can speak into that.
Well, I often bump into this first grade friend and we laugh about the fact that I was sitting next to him and I wanted to steal his white crayon because I didn't have a white crayon, but it was really tempting. I didn't steal it, but boy, did I want to steal that crayon from Dickie.
Wow, okay, that was great. Very good. Now, I want you to know, C.S. Lewis in his Problem of Pain, he says one of the things we do to delude ourselves is we think that time erases our sins, so at least... yeah. Right, still there. Does anybody else have, with a bold, loud voice, want to share their early experience of conscience? More volunteers? Well, yes, oh great, okay. Yeah.
I was probably about 7 years old. I accidentally put something in my pocket at a store with my parents. Came home and I realized it was still in my pocket. And I realized I'd stolen this small thing that was like $1 or something like that. And I felt just awful about it. My parents were like, well, we can't drive back to the store. It was like way far away. We can't drive back to the store. We never returned it. And that's like burned in my mind. So I stole this thing.
Right.
And it just kind of flooded on me when I was 7 years old.
Right. Very good. Well, like you, you guys were both more noble than I, because I stole a chocolate from the Whitman's 4 candy sampler? There's only one of those that really tastes very good to me, and that's the solid chocolate one with the little guy on it. No, 4-year-old really wants a strawberry cream chocolate. So I decided to take my sister's, and I figured I could get away. I don't know how I thought I would get away with it, because she also would obviously know that particular candy was missing. But I think that was maybe my first real crime. And I knew I wasn't supposed to do it, but I did it anyway, and then I lied about it, as though someone else did it, And then I did this, and then I had this candle. I don't know why my mom bought me a candle. She was kind of eccentric, but I had this little tea candle in my room, and I didn't like that the wax looked funny once it had been burning for a bit. It wasn't solid anymore, so I thought, well, I'll just get rid of that part, and I put it in the sink. And then, of course, my mom said, now, Natalie, there's something in the sink, do you want to tell me about it? And I said, what could it be? I don't know. Well, you must have done, I didn't do that, like, you know, I mean, I was under 6, but I'm haunted by C.S. Lewis here, you know, because I realized I was untruthful in these instances. But, yes, and I had a similar thing with something like that at a store. I went back with money. I finally got Jiminy Cricket won the day, and I finally went back in some other time and slipped money on a counter. So, and I watched my son at Cedar Point, Nathan, who's just turned 11 last year. He wanted to buy me something at a gift shop, and we had a couple of things, and he was contributing his money to it. And when we got out, he said, I don't know if they had this on the receipt. Can I check it out? And we looked, and they didn't. And then he was deciding, what do I do? I want to return it, and I want to go pay for it, but I'm scared they're going to think I stole it and arrest me. So now he has this complicated moral decision, and I said, we'll go back in and we'll explain what happened, and I'm sure they won't arrest us, And they haven't yet come for us. We're okay, but it's those moments where we have that kind of, and that is really important. I mean, we laugh about it because it seems so foolish when we think about, worrying about a crayon or, whether we have a piece of chewing gum we're not supposed to have or something like that, or a piece of candy, in my case. You know what, I should send my sister a pack of Whitman's chocolates. A big box of them, and then that will compensate for my crime.
With interest.
But that's really, it's important to consider this because everyone has this experience, and it's actually vitally connected to the human person. And in light of a Christian theological perspective, it is indelibly related to the idea of the person as a creature, a person as made and formed for and with God and in relationship to God, and is, in that sense, I think, perhaps an under-discussed aspect of the Christian life and the formation of the person. That is, we perhaps should talk more about conscience and how to form it. One of the things that the Christian tradition in its development, which I'll be talking about over the next couple of weeks, does is it looks at conscience as sort of innately there, but also requiring formation, also requiring a scaffold that is intentional and thoughtful, and this is perhaps, I would say it's quite necessary insofar as the context in which a person lives and heralds from does a great deal in forming what they consider to be normative. So some of those seemingly innate experiences, probably before we're too far along, have already been adjusted or shaped in a couple of different ways based on what social norms might be. And so if there are intentional sort of Christian norms that are valuable for the shaping of consciences, it would behoove us to put a great deal of energy into this thing that is inherently part of each of us, and that is such a vital act. It's our own mind, indeed. It is the interior self in dialogue with God as a part of our very being. So the plan for today, to advance our conversation in this initial session, is to consider conscience, just very briefly. All of these are going to be quite brief. They're more like brain ticklers that you can do more with, but in developmental perspective. And then to look at conscience in the Bible, again in a kind of terse way, but just to give you an example of how we might plumb this further in Jesus and the disciples and friends and in Paul. And then the conscience of self-authorship. So this is sort of our goal for today's discussion. So, in developmental perspective. So what I always do when I'm thinking about a new topic is I look at words. I think it's very important to be precise to the extent that we can. Concise and precise, as clearly and simply as can be. And so part of that is knowing what our words mean, because we use this word conscience as though we know what we're talking about. And then it's one of those things that starts to evade us as soon as we start breaking it down. But the word derives from, and this is true not only of the Latin word here, but also the Greek word, which will be used in the New Testament. It's a two-part word that means knowing with. And that with is the difference is all in that prefix, that C-O-N prefix. That is the difference that makes the difference. Because it suggests that it is a knowledge that is not my own knowledge, but it is a co-knowledge. It is a knowledge with. And then the question is, well, what is it with? And that's going to be, and our answer to that, obviously, is going to be God. But that this is something that is both within the self and that also is extrinsic to the self. That there is a complement that's already sort of interiorly present. And so it had, so I was also interested in the various uses of this idea of conscience in the context in which Christianity would have arisen and when the biblical materials would have been developed. And so in the pre-Christian world of antiquity, the Western antiquity, there was an operational use of the idea of conscience. It tended to have that sort of negative bent, that it's the sort of condemning thing in the self that judges the self when the self is doing something wrong. Now, we will see that conscience can have a much larger and much more, a divinizing quality even in the self. But it had this character, almost this juridical sense of being something that was used in the self to condemn the self, or it could be used as thinking about complicity, like this idea that there was a kind of complicit knowledge. And so conscience has this discussion. It's part of the philosophical world. And at least these two things are present in our world of antiquity that would have been our bed for Christian thinking. One is that there is a differentiation between moral philosophy and pre-philosophical innate knowledge. So one would be kind of structured teaching or doctrine or norms that are learned and taught, and another would be that sort of interior knowing. Okay? So in later philosophical systems, we use language like a posteriori, which means like derived from experience. And we use terms like a priori, which means something that comes before experience, something that's innate or already present. So however we want it, whatever language we want to use to describe it, there is a valuable differentiation between those two things. Now, if we were just spending our time thinking about that, we could ask, well, is that real? Like, is that really a genuine conflict or a distinction? And I think there could be some interesting conversations to be had there. But this seems to be the kind of consensus that there's this, that we can talk in one sense about moral training, but in another sense we have this innate moral awareness. And another is that conscience and consciousness, that is self-awareness and that like voice of the thing inside that says don't steal the gum or don't take the white crayon or whatever, that is different from my self-awareness. So I can be aware of myself, but then I also can be aware of something within myself. I think the image of like the angel and the devil on the shoulders is kind of useful because it's a visual representation of like multiplicity within the self. So this is an interesting segue into what is important when we think about Jesus' consciousness, or conscience and consciousness, because we are dealing with a complex interior being when we talk about who he was and what he knew and so on. Now, Christians will take up this question, but one of the things that's going to dog Christian discussion of conscience is the idea of sin. Because if we are corrupted by sin, in needing of salvation, then does that suggest that this interiority, this moral voice within or whatever, that also has been polluted, that it is somehow broken so that our conscience doesn't work anymore particularly well? And so that's something that they are aware of as a theological problem, which, as we will see in the coming weeks, is parsed out in a number of different ways. But there is a gigantic effort at preserving the idea that conscience is not corrupted in some essential way, and that we have, through that conscience, a kind of experience of God within. Okay, so, where to begin? This is just basically what I have said, but I think conscience is extremely important because it has this sort of grandiose description and value as the location of God speaking within. It has, we will see, in next week, we'll see St. Augustine talking about it as an interior illumination that allows for discernment and even for the reading of Scripture. So this, not just that which judges us, but that which enables us to understand what is truly the good and to seek after it. The location of God's grace, I mean, this becomes, during the late medieval and into the Reformation period, a very important part of thinking about how we experience the grace of God. And fundamentally, the core of the theological person that makes it, that can give the assent to God, that is not just bound by some doctrine, but can meaningfully, truly engage and be genuinely present. And therefore can show up. When you show up to pray, when you show up to sing, when you show up for your work, that you're really there. So conscience is, I would say, the primary theological, anthropological concern. So it has really great value for us to consider together. So conscience in the Bible, conscience of Jesus. As I started thinking about this question of, right, well, what would Jesus' conscience be like? I realized we are already encountering a major Christological challenge. And I think this idea of problematizing our stories and problematizing our truths is extremely valuable because it helps us to see them much more richly. It's like breaking down a complicated recipe and understanding the various ingredients that go into it. Yes?
What does it mean to problematize?
Well, to complicate and to break open and to, instead of just assuming we know what we're talking about, to start like looking for the things we don't understand or that we are taking for granted, and then so also from my childhood days, I used to occasionally sit there and think about a word until it became meaningless. Like the word stairs in particular, or bangs, like the bangs that you wear in your, sometimes they call them fringe. Why is it a bang? What does the bang mean? Like, does it give my face more bang? But until it became nonsense, But it's that kind of pondering to discover. And so considering the conscience of Jesus immediately brings up the problem of the character of Jesus and the natures of Jesus. So this is an interesting coincidence that it was just earlier, well, I guess at the beginning of last week, my son, who's the 14-year-old, asked me, he said, "Mom, can you have a little conversation with me? I have a theology paper I'm writing and I'm just curious about your thoughts on something." And I said, "Yeah, sure, obviously. Great. My kid wants to talk to me about theology. Woohoo! Yes, let's go." I wasn't that exuberant. I just said, "Yes, of course." But he said, "So do you think Jesus knew he was the Son of God? Like, how does that affect his life?" He's like, "I don't think he couldn't know that. Like, it seems to me that there are a couple of moments, like the wedding feast of Cana, it would be pretty obvious that something special was happening with him, even if he wasn't previously aware of anything. There would have been examples throughout his life." And he was saying, "I have a really difficult time with sort of extracting this low Christology of sort of just this human kind of ambling through life, doing really well, unlike the rest of us, versus, he said this, he described it as sort of this, the alpha and the omega on each hand sort of like barreling through space-time, is also an inadequate way of thinking about Jesus. So we were talking about this, and it really is at the heart of this idea of conscience. So conscience, in the Bible, Jesus' conscience is not really examined in that particular way. But thinking about who he was, we have this model of, what would Jesus do? And we put it on the rubber band and we walk. And I think to myself, well, that's a really weird thing to be asking ourselves. It starts with asking, well, what did Jesus know? And what did Jesus say and do? But then it also gets to who's storied or narrated Jesus' sayings and doings, and then who's reading Jesus' sayings and doings. We're putting a great deal of ourselves into the reading of the story of Jesus when we ask those questions. But the idea of Jesus' conscience intersects with his intellect, his freedom, the freedom of the will, what he knew, his own self-awareness. All of those things are engaged, and they became, although they don't speak of it specifically in the Christian debates about the person of Jesus in the first millennium, really, of Christianity, but certainly through the 600s. They're actually looking at what's going on in his mind that he does these things, and how do we relate to those things? That's really what's at stake. If he's just, sort of zooming through with this, godlike experience that is inaccessible to us, it doesn't have the same impact as it does if he is experiencing the human life that we also walk. And so the point of examining the life of Jesus and the natures of Jesus and the intellect of Jesus and the will of Jesus and the way that the Christian thinkers did for hundreds of years was motivated by the necessity to make that meaningful to the story of salvation for people. So if we examine the life of Jesus, I think there are places where we can find some indicators about his conscience as a model for his community and also as something that affects the disciples and the people that he interacts with, and that becomes the foundation for the church today. So where would you look to find examples of his conscience at work? And I came up with this list, which is basically the list. And I thought, well, all right, let's see where we can, if we look at the scripture texts, where do we get key indicators? Now, this is a difficult challenge because, and you'll see here, I've jumped all around the Gospels. So that in and of itself is a good, I don't know if you want to say red flag, but you should mark it and recognize that that's what's happening here. Because we're dealing with different stories about Jesus. We're trying to pull together a concept of what his conscience might have been by drawing from different narratives about his life. So, and I'm not going to read the full text. I just wanted to put them up here to give us some, at least the places where we would look. But I'll only read the parts that I've highlighted in red. So, in the baptism, we get this wonderful experience of Jesus who is being baptized by John, who's a little bit uncomfortable about the whole thing, and he's saying, no, we got to go for it. And then a voice from heaven says, this is my son, whom I love, with him I am well pleased. So I highlight that because of the piece about sonship. This is kind of where I've landed with this, the relationship with God. The boy Jesus at the temple, another important place where we get some insight into what Jesus might have been thinking and doing, right? His family goes on this annual pilgrimage. They're going home. They're obviously not helicopter parents if they don't notice he's not. Because I think about this and I'm like calling for my kids in the house, like, are you guys still here? I do this in the car. I'll do roll call 20 minutes after we're down the road somewhere. And I only have 2 of them, so I'm kind of ridiculous, but he says, you know, why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house? So these odd kind of stories are telling us something about who he is, and he has been identified as son. He identifies with this idea of fatherhood, God's fatherhood. I think the testing in the wilderness is an important place to consider his conscience, of course. He is relying on, now here, this is interesting because I think he's relying on kind of moral instruction. If you think about the distinction between moral teaching and innate knowledge, here I think he's operating out of his kind of like moral knowledge about what you're supposed to do, what has previously been written. But he is, and he also, it's kind of interesting now, I didn't think about this when I put up the slide, but he isn't here saying, from the mouth of my Father, do not put my Father to the test, worship my Father and serve him only. He is speaking in a more kind of formal way, extrinsically about God. And the I am sayings, I mean, the mission and language of Jesus, this is, that John is so different in the way that he describes, I'm sorry, that's blurry, it didn't translate well, but John's language with these I am sayings, these 7 I am sayings, are unique, but I also think that they are important because that's how the biblical curators, not even the biblical writers, but the curators of the Bible, have chosen to include these statements of being, these declarations, which would definitely suggest that his own self-awareness is kind of different from like the average person's self-awareness. I think obviously the story of his facing the end of his life, to me, is where he is both most human and also most divine. Because he is in this terrible crucible, this terrible place of aloneness, and he's looking for support from the people that he is with. And he tells them this is about to happen. He uses the language Son of Man, which is a very studied term in scripture scholarship. People are fascinated by what this term means because it doesn't actually mean just like a person. It means one who has a special relationship to God. So it means kind of the inverse of what it says. So he uses that self, or he is recorded as using that self-descriptor. Here we have that again. He is referencing his Father's kingdom. When he's at the Last Supper, he's saying to them, I will be in my Father's kingdom. So he's drawing back on that language of fatherhood. Again, this is the moment in Gethsemane, which to me is just so profound, where he's gone, several times to his friends and they're sleeping, and he's asking, why can't you just stay up with me? And then he kind of has to, he just stands up and faces it, like he's ready to go, even though he doesn't want to do this. And he speaks in the same language of his extraordinary nature. I think this is really interesting. Another place where you could say, okay, well, what does Jesus think about himself, and what is, what's operating within him, is this moment when he's challenged by Pilate. Who are you? Are you the king of the Jews? And, we have these different translations of it. Because I always hear this as, you're the one saying that. Like, kind of, you think you're perfect. You're the one that said that, kind of this pulling back. But the Greek is actually just su leges, which just means you say. Like, so we get all these inflections. The only place it's different, and this is the same in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the place that's different is in John, where he responds with a question. And he responds with, did somebody tell you that, or is that your own, are you thinking that yourself? And then Pilate inquires about truth, and then it becomes this dialogue about truth and how you discover truth. But that's an interesting and I think kind of cryptic and very ambiguous, wording attributed to Jesus here. And then the final words of Jesus during the crucifixion event. And I've highlighted the ones which seem to suggest to me, once again, that like total awareness of his unique relationship to God, and if you think about whatever that experience he must have had as he is facing these things, if these are the things that are attributed to him, he is speaking in a very profound way about a connection that he has with God the Father.
Question.
Yes?
Would it be a significant distinction where he says my father as opposed to just father?
Yeah, and I think so. I think so. The language, I looked up a variety of things about the word Abba, which is, given this spin as being this extremely intimate term, like daddy or something like that. And it's really the only Aramaic term for father. Like if you're going to refer to God as father, this is the term you're going to use. So there's nothing in that is particularly private, but the fact that he's using this term at all suggests an intimacy of relationship. All right. So if I looked at those things together, and I'm trying to think about what would his conscience have been like, I think that throughout so this would have been my answer to my son when he's asking me this, I would say that the parables, the ministry, the life and the death, all of these things, throughout his life and his work, the way that it is recorded and presented to us in Scripture is that it exhibits some sort of unique God consciousness. That is a really strange story. I mean, again, to harken back to C.S. Lewis when he talks about his conversion to Christianity, he says, like in the end, it seemed to me that it had to be true, because the other option would be that it was totally mad, and that didn't make any sense to me. But when we think about what we have said here, this is a really unique claim about what this person is experiencing. Does that God consciousness, can we infer from that some sort of specific thing about his conscience, that is about Jesus' interior mind? And I don't know how far we can press that, except to say that I think one thing is clear about what drove his conscience, and that would be the relationship with his Father, which determines in this extremely, I would say, almost linear and inarguable way, the full trajectory of his life as it is recorded and presented to us in the Gospels. These are, I realize we don't have a lot of time, but I only have a couple of slides here, so you can rest assured. Conscience in the disciple, friends and disciples, or in the Bible. I just pulled out a couple of examples. I'm not going to read the scripture passages, obviously for time. But I was thinking, where do we find, because this is not also something that is explicitly considered. Like, no one says, okay, well, what was Martha's conscience when she decided to go into the kitchen and work? But there are places where we see the encounter with Jesus eliciting some sort of engagement of conscience. I think one, and sometimes it's favorable and sometimes it's in this sort of condemning way. One is in, the examples where people are really emboldened to do things differently because of Jesus. And they are having that innate response simply because of the encounter with him. It doesn't, I think that's how you can say, follow me, and they just go, because they know it to be true. Also, there's this sort of self-condemning piece, as in when the rich young man who's saying, I've done everything right, what do I do now? And he says that, well, I get rid of everything. He's just like, oh, man, I don't wanna. And goes away, and he knows better. You can feel it in him, that tension of, he knows what he has just heard is the truth, and he does not, he can't do it yet. He doesn't want to do it. Judas is a great story of the conscience. We have a couple of different ends to Judas in Matthew and Acts. But the whole, this idea that there's this tainted event that has happened and nobody wants to touch it after the fact. You really can see, a conscience of the people in response to this thing that has gone down as worthy of their examination and commentary. Also worthy of note that these are stories about how, where the writers of these texts are imagining, what is it to be Judas? What does that feel like? And because we're all kind of that too, right? We're all doing, so there's this that kind of harrowing consideration of this person that has done this thing and what the consequences are. Peter betraying Jesus. Same thing, he's weeping bitterly. Although we're not saying, well, his conscience got the best of him, we see him really down about like his failure in that. I think Pilate washing his hands is another, and it's also interesting, like the bottom two examples, where you have the Romans, like who are getting it, and these are also important narratival devices because they're kind of cleaning up the Roman story, right? But we also see these figures affirming Jesus in various ways. The Roman centurion at the end, and the others among whom who say, "Oh, he truly was the Son of God." Yeah, I guess we didn't see that one initially, but now we do. Where they're having these moments of elucidation and illumination. So, insights about his friends and disciples, I would say that the thing we can derive more than anything is that the conscience is triggered. That innate thing is triggered and brought more into action through the encounter with Jesus. Sometimes through, initiating sort of bold responses like in Mary's story, or a test of values as in the rich boy's story, or bringing about guilt and remorse, which is going to lead to this whole confessional thing we'll talk about next week. Sometimes truth proclamations, when you speak from a place of knowing, even when it's scary and risky to do so. And all of these are stories, and again, bear in mind, these were records that are handed down to us to think about how he impacted this life, these people, this community, which then became the foundation for Christian thought later. So these stories about conscience are at the core of Christian identity. And we see this in Paul, where conscience, now Paul's writings, as we know, predate the Gospels. But conscience, Paul does actually speak specifically to conscience. And various indexes will have it at 29 or 31, so I landed with 30 different places where conscience pops up. And it's a Greek term, which is exactly corresponding to the Latin term, which is also a knowledge with. Right? In Acts, Romans, Corinthians, Timothy, Hebrews, Peter. And he tends to use it in two ways, and I use this one example from Romans, where he says, "Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves even though they don't have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, and their consciences are also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them." And so what I would say about Paul's expression of conscience, point 4, is that his discussion of conscience in those 30-some places in his letters not only discusses the behavior of the community, but also speaks to the ontological character of the community, which gets to that innate piece, that co-native, co-natural, co-knowledge. That it's not just that they are formed by some external teaching, but that the character of the community is a community that is innately led by the Word of God, the internal voice. So, if I want to summarize my theme here for today, conscience of Jesus is not explicitly unpacked in the Gospels. We have to go looking for it. It will be more so explicitly unpacked in the developing tradition as the Christology of who and what Jesus was is examined. 2, Jesus' conscience in the Bible is intertwined with his God consciousness. And that those two things seem to demonstrate a seamless relationship with God, which I think is a really interesting thing to consider. The gospel characters demonstrate a grappling with conscience in their encounters with Jesus. He disrupts what you're doing and engages that sense of conscience. And then, as I noted with Paul, his discussion of conscience is not just about teaching at this point and what the community should do, but it's about the law sort of written on the hearts, the covenant inside. So the last slide here for today. The biblical stories about Jesus and the first Christians present a growing definition of the source of innate moral co-knowledge or con-science. And I broke up innate to also suggest it's something that is inborn, right? So this idea that while the pre-Christian philosophical discussions of conscience recognize some extrinsic something, what Christians seem to be adding to that here is that they're identifying the source. They're identifying where the co part is, where it comes from. The narrative of Jesus' life and crucifixion is the revelation of his co-being with God. It's not just about the point of death for the point of resurrection. It's about the being, the relational being with the Father. And the narratives of Jesus' teaching are didactic stories about the transformation of conscience through encounter. So that's one way, if you wanted to look at any of the parables or any of the actions and you ask this question about how is the conscience of the individual being changed or engaged, you get a slightly different kind of illumination in that reading. And so it's just an interesting tool for reading stories. And then finally, the instruction for the community in Paul revises that juridical or just merely kind of like guilt reading of conscience, like the condemning interior voice, and rather places it in the context of baptismal life. That is the whole character of the community. And this will be the stage for the way that conscience is discussed in the developing tradition. So when we reconvene next week, we'll be looking more at that and that evolving notion of storytelling and confession in Christian life. So thank you so much.
Dr. Weaver will be here for a few minutes for questions, and next week we'll be back downstairs. Any questions?
Which was the book of the gospel where you say